Okay, so I'm happy to introduce, oh my gosh, Michelle Balmer. I just met Michelle, but Michelle is part of the Lake Restoration Program at Iowa Department of Natural Resources, but I will let her provide a little more background on her work there. So, thanks.
Good morning. You nearly made it to lunch. Congratulations. You just have to sit through my talk. Today I'm going to talk about lake monitoring in Iowa, and I have to acknowledge Dan Kendall, who would be standing here. He was called away to the UMRCC meeting in Redwood, Minnesota, and is the lake monitoring coordinator for the state. It's a position I formerly held, so we tag team a lot on projects, and that's why I'm up here today and not him. So today we're going to talk a little bit about the monitoring program within the state. This is what we consider our Ambient Lake Monitoring Program. We're going to talk a little bit about what we've learned from it statewide and then look at a couple of individual case studies. So the monitoring program began in 2000. I'm going to try and shift, see if this works, so I can see and talk at the same time. Monitoring program began in 2000 after a statewide fund was established for monitoring, the Environment First Fund, and it's continued every year since then. It was based on the recognizing that there was a need for continuous water quality monitoring data across the state that would allow us to do what was required under the Federal Clean Water Act and assess those water bodies. Are they meeting their designated uses? And then we also wanted to use it as a tool for prioritizing lakes for restoration and just get a general picture of what's going on statewide in our lakes, both constructed and natural. The original study lakes and the bulk of the lakes were chosen based on the 70s and 80s studies completed by Roger Bachman. And so those lake surveys kind of served as a backbone for where we would take this program. And since then, it's remained pretty constant. We've had a little shift from lakes being listed as included in the program from year to year, but for most of the 130 some lakes that we monitor annually, they've been around for 17 years, and so we're starting to get a pretty good long-term data record. In fact, if you compare our program to a lot of the other ones around the world, you'll find that Iowa has a really unique data set and that it is one of the most robust and biggest programs within the country and in large part the world. So we monitor a variety of parameters as a part of this program. At the lake, we take a number of field parameters to try and capture a snapshot of what's going on, anything from temperature, trying to determine whether there's a thermocline in the lake, looking at the dissolved oxygen concentrations, turbidity, specific conductivity, and then we'll use the Secchi disk to take water clarity. And then we take a variety of samples, and we do this with our partners at Iowa State University. Dr. Grace Wilkinson, now and formerly John Downing, ran labs that had student technicians go out and collect these samples, bring them back to the laboratory for analysis. And so there are a variety of parameters that they look at once the samples hit the lab. The nitrogen series, of course, phosphorus dissolved as well as the total phosphorus. And then looking at a breakdown of the suspended solids, we want to see what's coming from organic sources, what's inorganic, looking at alkalinity, dissolved organic carbon, and then we want to look at some measures of biomass or algal production within the lake. And so we use chlorophyll A, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, as a proxy for some of that. It's just a photosynthetic pigment that's found in all of phytoplankton, and we use that as a surrogate. But we also look at the actual phytoplankton biomass and composition. So we have student technicians look under the scope and count and identify and measure a variety of both phytoplankton and zooplankton. This is where our program really differs from a lot of ones countrywide because it's a very labor-intensive and time-intensive process to do these kind of biomass estimates, and so it really sets Iowa apart from other places in the world that we have a 17-year monitoring data set with 130 some lakes where we have these biomass composition. New to 2017, and to try and address some of the ongoing challenges that we face as a state with harmful algal blooms in particular, we're looking at phycocyanin as a new pigment to try and quantify as a part of the program. We've recognized over the last 17 years that chlorophyll is a great measure in some of our systems, but it's not always the best measure, and there's times when we've gone out to a lake that looks very, very green and had a very low chlorophyll rating. So then it's kind of like, well, there's got to be something else going on. They have to be expressing a different pigment. So that's one of the reasons why we're picking up phycocyanin this year. And as you heard this morning, microcystin is one of those things that we really need to start addressing on a larger scale basis than just at our statewide beaches. And so we're incorporating the microcystin toxin analysis into our lake study this year to try and get a better understanding of what's happening throughout the basin, not just at the beach. So we sample a variety of types of lakes. Iowa, as you know, has predominantly constructed lakes or man-made lakes. We do have some natural lakes. There's about 30 in the state. And we monitor quite a few of our natural lakes. As you probably are aware, most of our natural lakes are pretty shallow, save for West Okoboji. And we also monitor a variety of those oxbow lakes, those cut off from former river channels. So you can see the different types and stuff. We've got pretty good spatial coverage throughout the state. We try and go to those lakes 3 times each summer, unless there's construction activities or other things that would prevent us from making it there. So we try and hit up a lake early in the summer, so that May time frame, midsummer about July, and then in late summer that August, September. So we can see what's happening in an individual system throughout the growing season. These are, granted, they're just snapshots, but they do give us a view of what's happening periodically throughout the lake. And when you start to build year upon year upon year of data, you can get a much better picture of what's happening at both individual systems and statewide. So if we think about Iowa, and I've kind of talked about it a little bit, about how we relate to or how we're different or similar to other programs within the country, we're doing pretty well, I think. Granted, when you compare us to Minnesota and Wisconsin, we have considerably fewer lakes than either of those states have. And so that's one of the reasons why we have such great coverage across our state. Minnesota operates on predominantly a citizen monitoring program that utilizes volunteers to help collect data. And they use this primarily for the SECI data that they've then translated along with remote sensing to try and get water quality, or water clarity, estimates for individual lakes across the entirety of the state. They also use a rotating basin approach, and they transfer from groups of watersheds to groups of watersheds and study the lakes within those watersheds on a periodic basis. There's about 100 basins that they rotate through. And so because they have so many systems, this is a system that works really well for Minnesota because they only have the ability to go to so many at one point in time. There's just too many, and as you all know, monitoring costs money. And then they, like I mentioned earlier, they use that remote sensing data to try and get a snapshot of what's going on statewide for all the lakes that they can't be on a more regular basis. Wisconsin predominantly uses a citizen monitoring program where they certify a variety of volunteers to go out and collect samples and then send them into a laboratory. And it's a great way to utilize volunteer workers to help both contribute to what's going on within their state and to collect valuable pieces of data. As I'm sure anyone who's done a lot of field work can tell you, oftentimes the cost in monitoring comes down to the amount of time it takes to collect the sample and less about how much time it takes or what it takes to analyze the sample. And then a couple other programs that I looked into were Florida and Nebraska. Nebraska, as you well know, doesn't have a whole lot of lakes, and so they focus on 44 lakes within the state and monitor monthly between May and September. And Florida, again, utilizes a citizen monitoring program to do the bulk of their monitoring. They also have a 3-tiered system that kind of looks at when they will go back to a certain lake. So which ones are monitored every year, every 5 years, or so forth. So I was doing pretty great in that we're monitoring over 130 every year. So what do we do with the data? We collect a lot of data. The primary use for the data is the completion of those biannual water quality assessments that are required of the Clean Water Act. We have what's called a designated use, or a list of designated uses for each of our water bodies in the state. And so every year or every other year we go and we pull a set of water quality data and look to see if they're meeting the criteria that we've established for those individual designated uses. That's where, if you've ever heard of the impaired waters list, it's tied to those assessments. We produce a lot of annual lake status reports. So where are we? How is water quality improving or declining throughout the state? We use it to track long-term trends. And a lot of the data feeds what we call the TMDL, or Water Quality Improvement Plan, for an individual lake. So when we've identified a lake as being impaired, we use the lake monitoring data to build a model that will help us figure out how much pollution reduction we need to achieve in order for it to meet its water quality goals. And then finally, and this is the area that I work on most now, is we prioritize lakes for restoration using this data set. So I've learned a variety of things from this program, and to help guide you through the remainder of the talk today, I want to talk a little bit about one measure that we use that is based on some of the monitoring data, called the Carlson's Trophic State Index. It's an index that allows us to compare a variety of different water quality parameters on the same scale. And what it helps us do is put lakes into bins, if you will. We often classify lakes in the limnology world as being anywhere on a scale from what we call oligotrophic, or very nutrient poor, to hypereutrophic, extremely nutrient rich. And as you might guess, most of the lakes in Iowa fall within the eutrophic or the hypereutrophic categories. So the ones down here, we've kind of put Secchi disc pictures up there to help orient you a little bit. Oligotrophic generally has pretty good water clarity. And as you become more and more nutrient enriched, water clarity generally goes down. So I'm going to talk a lot about the TSIs, or the Carlson Trophic State Index, moving forward, just to help you orient yourself to that. So when we look on a statewide basis, we can see that we've got a lot of those eutrophic and hypereutrophic systems, as indicated by the green and the orange dots. And this one I use Secchi for. We generally look at three measures: chlorophyll, phosphorus, and the Secchi measurement. And all three of those are put on that same scale using a formula that Carlson developed that allow us to see where it falls between a value of 1 and 100. So the vast majority of our lakes fall in those eutrophic, very nutrient-rich, to extremely nutrient-rich categories, which is probably no surprise. So one of the overarching questions that we always get asked is water quality getting better or worse since the program began? Because that's really the best piece of data that we have, is that long-term monitoring set. We can look a little bit at those snapshots that Bachman did in the 70s and 80s, but for the most part, we rely strictly on this long-term record that we've been generating since 2000. And I know this is going to look really kind of crazy because all of the 130 lakes are on this. But what we've looked at is deviation away from a mean, essentially. So are they getting better or worse relative to their average? And so what you can see is that in the case of our lakes, about half of them look like they're getting better, aka they have a negative slope. The TSI is going down. It's getting closer to 1, getting better. Half of them look like they're getting worse. In terms of phosphorus concentration. This is looking at basically how much nutrient enrichment is there. And as you all know, phosphorus is predominantly the limiting nutrient in many of our lake systems. So we look at it a lot. So about half and half for phosphorus. But what about water clarity? We can actually see that the TSI is continuing to go up in a lot of our lakes, which means that water clarity is actually declining since we've started monitoring this set of lakes within the state of Iowa. And there are some notable exceptions. A lot of the lakes where there have been extensive restoration projects, or there have been differences in land use or other factors, have helped push some of the systems towards a more clear water state, and we've seen a drop in that TSI value, or an improvement in water clarity. It's interesting that while phosphorus hasn't really changed, it's retained relatively stable in lakes. We've seen big changes in terms of water clarity, both from a non-algal perspective and from an algal perspective, as you can see reflected in this graph. And those two are tied. Usually when there's an increase in chlorophyll concentration, there's also a drop in overall water clarity, or Secchi disc. So you can see that the majority of the lakes have actually seen an increase in their chlorophyll A concentration relative to their mean over that time scale as well. So what about the last 5 years? We've considered the long term, that's 17 years since 2000. What about the last 5 years? Here we see a little bit different of a story. That predictor variable, that total phosphorus concentration, we actually see that a lot of lakes in the last 5 years have dropped in terms of their total phosphorus concentration. There are some pretty good exceptions too. Some of these lakes have had extensive restoration work done. And then we can see big drops in those phosphorus concentrations. Sadly, we've also seen some increases in our total phosphorus concentrations at several of our lakes. And that's reflected in the water clarity as well. We've seen that in the last 5 years, we've generally had a little bit better water clarity compared to that 17-year average. However, what is interesting to me is that chlorophyll has remained pretty consistent. About half of the lakes are improving in terms of their chlorophyll A concentration, and half are degrading. And so it looks like there might be a shift, especially in some systems, in changes between the amount of water clarity that can be attributed to algal versus non-algal biomass. So what we like to see is, are they really changing a lot in the last 5 years relative to what they did a long time ago, or are they pretty consistent? And we have to do this on a big scale because it's really hard with these individual pieces of data to say much of a story about individual lakes. And the goal of this program is really to take a statewide snapshot. But you can see that they've been pretty consistent. About half of the lakes statewide are changing in terms of water clarity total phosphorus concentrations getting higher and total phosphorus concentrations getting lower. And again, I can point to pretty specific cases for why we know that's happening. So I want to call your attention to one way over here, which you've heard a little bit about this morning already, is Carter Lake. It's the very last one on this plot. And you can see that phosphorus concentrations have dropped pretty substantially in the last 5 years relative to the 17-year average. And what we've learned here is we've done a massive restoration project on Carter Lake. There was some dredging, there was an alum treatment, there was a lot of watershed work that was completed, a fishery renovation, and all of those things helped lead to this severe decline in phosphorus concentrations. And so we can move the needle in terms of nutrients if we put all of our eggs in that one basket and really push a system. We see that's pretty consistent with a lot of the restoration lakes where there has been extensive work to try and reduce nutrients and sediment going to a lake. We see that we are being effective. We can also see drops in chlorophyll for about half of our lakes. And again, I want to point out Carter Lake. You've heard a lot about the microcystin concentrations and other blue-green algal problems at Carter Lake this morning. And what we've seen is that starting to change as a result of this restoration project. We've had a lot higher water clarity, and we're seeing a lot of positive movement towards better water quality at that particular lake. We've also seen that Seki is continuing to decline in more lakes, more than half of our lakes, unfortunately. And that is, there may be increased erosion, there may be increased algal biomass that's not always reflected in the chlorophyll A, but we do have some changes that indicate that statewide, the last 5 years have been a little rougher on water clarity than that 17-year average. So one of the things that we always try to look at is what is a statewide trend versus what's happening in an individual lake, because a lot of folks come to us and they say, that's great, I'm glad that you're doing all the stuff for the statewide, but I really only care about this one. And so we want to have enough information that we can talk about an individual lake as well as what's going on statewide. So I'm going to talk about a couple of case studies. Some of them you've already heard about a little bit. The other piece of data that I'm going to use is a water quality index that a colleague of mine, Rebecca Krogman, and I have been working on for a couple of years. And this has allowed us to take a variety of pieces of the ambient lake data, put them together, and come up with one number on a scale of 1 to 100. We think it's a little bit easier to understand than me telling you about the zooplankton biomass and the water clarity and the total phosphorus concentration all in tandem. So we're going to use the WQI. Generally, if the WQI equals 100, it's perfect drinking water, and if the WQI equals 0, it's sewage. So if you can think about that scale. This graph up here actually shows the TSIs as well. So 65 for 2 of our parameters is what we consider the impairment threshold for lakes. And we use that impairment threshold for chlorophyll A and for Seki depth. So that black line on that, that black line on that graph represents that impairment threshold. And you can see that if we plot all of the water quality data using those annual averages, we can see that over the course of the last 17 years, we've actually dropped those TSIs pretty significantly to the point where we think they'll be coming off the impaired waters list pretty soon. And if we look at our WQI, that index that I just described, we can see that that's what we see in the data as well when we look at even more water quality parameters put together. You can see that we've got a pretty positive trend, and the restoration kind of took place in this 2010 to 2012 area. So we don't have a ton of data post that, but you can see that it is steadily improving, and we are effective at removing phosphorus in particular, and how that's having an effect on the water clarity and chlorophyll A concentrations. So we can attribute a direct response in the water quality data to what we were doing within the lake and the watershed. Those changes have had a big impact on the lake, so much so that we went from a very green system to now a system that is pretty heavily vegetated. And so now the new problem has been how to effectively manage vegetation so that we don't have so much that boaters can't use it, or it's detrimental to the fish who are living in the system. And so to that end, the city and the Lake Restoration Program and others have worked to operate a vegetation harvester on the lake to help mow the lawn of vegetation, so to speak. And they've applied herbicide as well to help prevent an overabundance of those aquatic macrophytes. Another case I want to point out is Lake Wapello. Lake Wapello is in southern Iowa, and the total phosphorus concentrations really haven't changed a whole lot in the 16 years where we've got really good phosphorus data for this lake. However, we've seen a declining trend in water clarity. You can see that the TSI is going up, and it's slowly approaching that impairment threshold for water clarity. And we wanted to know what's happening at Lake Wapello. Why is there decreasing water clarity and increased chlorophyll A concentrations? Why have we seen these changes? Oops. What we've learned is Lake Wapello was a very early lake restoration project with a pretty extensive fishery renovation. And since then, there have been two things that have really happened, both within the lake and within the watershed, that we think are leading to some of these changes. The first is that land use has changed pretty substantially in this watershed. As you know, southern Iowa has experienced a lot of land use change with changing commodity prices over the last 10 years. And in the Wapello watershed in particular, the amount of land that was moved from pasture to row crop agriculture was pretty significant. And that, we think, has had an impact on the in-lake water quality results that we're seeing. The other thing is that there's been a reintroduction of rough fish, and as that population has slowly grown over the last 5 to 6 years, with more and more carp being recruited into the system, we think we're seeing increased turbidity and chlorophyll tied to that fish activity. But it's something that we want to continue to monitor and see what steps we can take to help reverse that trend. Okay, thanks. Another lake that we wanted to look at is Silver Lake in Delaware County. And this one, you can see that there's been a pretty substantial declining trend in the TSI values, which generally means water quality is improving. And we wanted to know what is leading to this water quality improvement. We did what's called a diagnostic and feasibility study in the early 2000s, and some great watershed work was put together by some project partners in the early 2000s to try and address some of the nutrient and sediment erosion from the watershed that was entering this lake. But the key component in this one actually turned out to be an engineering project that we started in 2001 and led to dam repair in the lake in the year 2007. And what this dam repair did, it's a pretty shallow lake, was actually raise the level of the lake. And that increased depth really had a pretty significant impact on the water quality in the lake when coupled with all of those watershed practices that were already being put in place. And so what you can see is post-2007, the trend really goes down, and we're moving down below that impairment threshold for the lake. It's a little bit more easy to see on the WQI graph because you have that clear marker of when the lake was being manipulated and we were changing the lake water level. And you can see that prior to the restoration, the water quality, while improving, wasn't improving as significantly as following the restoration. So those higher water levels stabilized the lake and allowed more consistent management and allowed for a little bit better residence time and things that would improve water clarity. Finally, because this is one of the most popular lakes in the state, I wanted to talk about West Okoboji Lake. It's also pretty unique in that it is probably the most nutrient poor, or so to speak, healthiest lake in the state, and it is very deep. So it's a bit of an outlier when you think about it in context of all the other Iowa lakes. Water clarity has remained pretty consistent over the last 17 years, although we have seen a slight decrease in the phosphorus concentration, which is fantastic, even though chlorophyll and Secchi depth have remained pretty consistent. The chlorophyll has gone down a little bit, and that's reflected also in the phytoplankton biomass, but the presence or the percent of cyanobacteria has always remained high, which is kind of a mystery in this lake. For a lake that's pretty nutrient poor, we still see upwards of 90% of the phytoplankton composition in cyanobacteria. One of the great things, though, is that there's a wonderful partnership of people up in the Okoboji chain and the Iowa Great Lakes that continue to work on the watershed in the lake to keep those Great Lakes clean. And so those have helped preserve water quality at this lake in particular. It also has a very small watershed size and is very deep, which plays into how it is able to sustain these really low nutrient concentrations and good water clarity, even in the face of changing land use in the watershed. One of the things that we're really interested in looking at long term is, now that there's been an introduction of zebra mussels into the Iowa Great Lakes, we really want to understand what effect that's having on water clarity in particular, and overall water quality. How is it changing the phytoplankton community? How is it changing nutrients? And moving forward, that's one of the questions that we hope to answer with this monitoring data. So we've learned a lot of things so far, but we still have some work to do. Some individual lakes, as we've kind of talked about, have had pretty dramatic changes over the last 17 years. But if you look at a global scale, things have remained relatively stable in the last 17 years. There have been some little changes in terms of nutrient levels have remained pretty consistent, although where water clarity has declined a little bit, and we've seen some increasing algal concentrations in some of our lakes. We do need to continue our monitoring to understand how these lakes are continuing to respond to things like invasive species, like climate change. And we're continuing to update those monitoring protocols every year to reflect the ongoing needs for water quality in the state. That's why we're really working with phycocyanin and microcystin this year, and we hope to move forward with those to really have a better handle on those HABs and try and quantify them better. As always, more in-depth analyses are needed, and we always wish there were more data available than there are. So we always look for opportunities to partner with others as well to try and bolster the success of this program and continue to make it more and more robust. So with that, I'll take whatever questions you have, and want to thank you for coming and sit through one more talk before lunch. Yeah. No, we can talk about that, and actually it's a great question that you brought that up. We're talking about bacteria, and this is one of the ongoing statewide efforts. Of course, we've heard a little bit about bacteria in our beaches, and in the early years of the program, we did actually test E. coli in the central part of the lake where all these samples are taken. But 9 times out of 10, and I'm putting that very lightly, it's really more like 90 out of 100 cases, we would see no hits at all. We wouldn't even be able to detect E. coli within the main part of the lake. However, as you well know, there are often pretty high concentrations at our beaches. And so one of the things that we're working on this year is to go back, and it's part of a long-term study that Alan's group up there is doing, is looking at, is bacteria isolated to the beach, or is it a lake-wide concern? Is it coming from the watershed? And so we're a couple years into a long-term program of trying to address that question, starting with increased monitoring at the beaches, looking at that wash zone right in between the water-sand interface. Are there characteristics to the beach that are promoting bacterial growth? Is it a lake-wide problem? Is it something that's coming in after heavy rain events and sticking around, so to speak, at the beaches? And so we're continuing to do amplified monitoring to try and address that question. But at present, it is not part of all 130 lakes, because we ran it for several years, and we very, very rarely saw hits at the deep point. So more to come on that one. Yeah, Alan?
I'll just add to that. Starting this year, in fact, it was just approved at EPC Tuesday, we are going back to adding bacteria to the ambient site and something on the order of 45 or 50 lakes where we currently have beach bacteria issues to try and either couple or decouple the ambient data from the beach data. Our hypothesis is that, as Michelle pointed out, the source of the problem is near shore of the beach, and it's not system-wide. So we want to make sure we have sufficient body of data to be able to represent that result as in fact true or where true to EPA. So when we write a TMDL, we're writing it for the near beach area, the near shore area of the beach, as opposed to writing it for the entire watershed and trying to fix a non-problem that is only isolated from the beach.
Thanks, Alan. You phrased that so much better than I could have. Yeah, Steve.
Michelle, your graph shows that 1% private lakes are eliminating or that great category.
Yeah.
Haven't we either one or two lakes?
Yes, it's Okoboji and Yellow Smoke. Yellow Smoke being in western Iowa, nutrient-wise. And I think water clarity-wise as well. Any other questions? Yeah. We do 3 samples annually through the growing season, starting like the 2nd or 3rd week of May and going through the end of September. So the goal is to hit 1 sample in each lake, May to June, 1 in the July timeframe, and 1 in that late August to September timeframe to try and capture early, mid, and late season. Usually in the early one, we're still seeing a lot of lakes that are destratified. And very rarely the stratification is broken down by that 3rd sampling. We usually see better water clarity in the early season, and as you probably know, algal blooms develop later in the summer, and that September samples can be pretty green. Thank you guys, and enjoy lunch.